The soldiers left, the administrators left all the colonies, but they still kept a significant degree of control over the financial flows from these former parts of empire and the rest of the world. So you could describe it as a second empire, Britain's second empire, sort of hidden financial empire.
We are still plundering developing countries as former colonial powers.
We tend to think of Africa as being a huge net debtor to the rest of the world. Do the maths. Far from being a net debtor, Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is a net creditor to the rest of the world.
The British Empire, the largest empire the world has ever known. For over 300 years, Britain ruled, its armies conquered, and its bankers proclaimed the might of its currency. But one day it all began to fall apart. One by one, countries declared their independence from Britain, and no amount of force could reverse the tide. As British elites saw their wealth, privileges, and empire disintegrate, they began to search for a new role in a changing world, and they found one in finance. This is a film about how Britain transformed from a colonial power to a modern financial power, and how this transformation has shaped the world we live in. In the days of the British Empire, the City of London was the world's biggest global financial centre.
The City of London was the kind of beating financial heart of the British Empire. The historians Kane and Hopkins called it the governor of the imperial engine. All these countries in the empire used to use the sterling currency, and the City of London was kind of the financier of this zone, not just inside the sterling zone, but outside the sterling zone as well.
As Britain's empire declined, so too did the City of London. As financiers withdrew their money from Britain, the value of the pound decreased. To protect the value of the pound, Britain limited the bank's overseas lending.
They were not able to invest abroad, and obviously they were unhappy. And we don't know exactly the context, but it's very clear that the banks or their representative made a representation to the Bank of England, which in itself was dominated by representatives from the banking industry. It seems that they have reached an agreement which was never written, that if the banks intermediated between two non-residents in a foreign currency, in that case the dollar, that this particular intermediation, this particular deal will not be considered by the Bank of England under its own jurisdiction.
The banks began to create a market for dollars in London, called the London Eurodollar market. To differentiate these euro market activities from their domestic banking activities, banks kept two sets of accounts. The Bank of England, the UK regulator, declared that the London euro market accounts were not in London. They were elsewhere, and therefore it had no responsibility for regulating them.
It's about providing a legal space in which you pretend activity is taking place. And the importance of that is that you pretend it's not taking place in the economy where it really is taking place. So you're taking activity from the place where it's regulated and taxed and pretending that it's happening elsewhere. Now, where doesn't really matter, it's just elsewhere.
Another new kind of financial space began to emerge, far away from London, in Britain's overseas jurisdictions, the last remnants of empire. Accountants and lawyers from London arrived in the Cayman Islands and other British dependencies and began to draft a set of financial secrecy laws and regulations. Because these jurisdictions' main selling point was secrecy, they were called secrecy jurisdictions.
What the Cayman Islands was doing was straightforwardly illegal activity. Drugs money was coming in huge quantities, tax evasion, whatever you wanted, you could have it.
The Bank of England was observing the developments from London and noted in a report marked secret, dated 11th of April 1969, "We need to be quite sure that the possible proliferation of trust companies, banks, etc., which in most cases would be no more than brass plates manipulating assets outside the islands, does not get out of hand. There is, of course, no objection to their providing bolt holes for non-residents, but we need to be sure that in so doing, opportunities are not created for the transfer of UK capital to the non-sterling area outside UK rules.
These small territories, the last remnants of the British Empire, which are still overseas territories today, they are still the last remnants of the British Empire. There are 14 of these overseas territories. 7 of them are bona fide tax havens, including the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, the British Virgin Islands. Some of the biggest tax havens in the world today are still British.
With access to large amounts of offshore money, the euro market grew rapidly. By 1980, it had reached $500 billion. By 1988, $4.8 trillion. And by 1997, nearly 90% of all international loans were made through this market. The British Empire had sunk, leaving hardly a trace behind. But the City of London adapted and survived. The City of London, London's financial district, is a peculiar place. It has been called a city within a city, a state within a state. It is run by an organisation called the City of London Corporation, a private company that performs all the functions of a local council with a private police force and private courts.
Those of you who aren't from the UK, some of you even who are, might not be aware just how weird a thing the little City of London is within the big London. The City of London is a separate entity to the wider London, and it has its own head, the Lord Mayor, who's distinct from the Mayor, who runs the rest of London. The City of London has long had this curious legal status because back in 1066, when William the Conqueror came over, the city was one of the only portions of England that he failed to conquer, and he struck a deal with the city in 1067 that allowed them to continue functioning.
To this day, the City of London is exempt from numerous laws that govern the rest of Britain. Its political system derives from the Middle Ages. The city's electorate is dominated not by its residents, but by the private businesses operating within the city. Its Lord Mayor is selected by the heads of medieval guilds.
They have a representative in the House of Commons called the Remembrancer. Apart from the clerks of the court of the House of Commons, he's the only unelected person there.
All other lobbyists have to stop, in the lobby. They're not allowed past the lobby.
The City of London has a permanent representative in the House of Commons, whose role is to report back to the City of London Corporation and to lobby Parliament on behalf of the city.
The Corporation of London, clearly, it's a unique and interesting phenomenon that should have attracted many political scientists, political economists and economists. But I don't know of anyone who has studied systematically the Corporation of London and its impact on policy or economic policy. So we can only surmise. Some people assume or surmise that the Corporation of London is extremely powerful and is able in one way or another to shape British policy, particularly in financial matters.
Clement Attlee, the Prime Minister after the Second World War, had something to say about the City of London Corporation.
He did, yes. So over and over again, we have seen that there is in this country another power than that which has its seat at Westminster. The City of London, a convenient term for a collection of financial interests, is able to assert itself against the government of the country. Those who control money can pursue a policy at home and abroad, contrary to that which has been decided by the people.
At the heart of the City of London stands the Bank of England. The Bank of England is not just a central bank, it is also a financial regulator. At the demise of empire, the Bank of England used this regulatory authority to help attract the world's banks to London. In 1972, the Bank of England issued a license to the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, which set up its head office in London. Within 10 years, BCCI grew into the 7th largest bank in the world. 10 years later, BCCI was bankrupt.
The deputy director of the CIA, Richard Kerr, said late today that the CIA did use BCCI to support CIA activities overseas.
But BCCI had not just collaborated with the world's intelligence services. It had also engaged in extensive financial fraud, money laundering, and terrorist financing.
BCCI constituted international global crime of a level that boggles the mind.
BCCI was financing terrorism. The Bank of England knew it, says the report, but instead of supervising it properly, it tried to prevent the bank's collapse.
I am saying very directly that the Bank of England had sufficient information in front of it to close BCCI 15 months earlier than it did. Millions of depositors were hurt in that process.
Numerous whistleblowers from BCCI had contacted the Bank of England, yet the Bank of England did nothing.
The Bank of England had plenty of time to intervene and investigate, but it did not do so because the tradition at that time, which still survives, is that, well, actually, you have to just kind of send hints and talk over lunch tables with the chaps regulating other chaps, and all would be well.
London was a place for banks to engage in business that was not allowed elsewhere, where senior bankers did not have to worry about the consequences of their actions. This is one of the reasons why today there are more banks in London than in any other financial centre.
In Britain, nobody goes to jail. No bankers go to jail. They generally don't. They are a protected species. And that is part of the offshore business model of the UK, is to say, we will protect you. We will bring your money here. We will look after you. We're not going to put you in prison. We'll let you do what you want.
From the 1960s onwards, City of London institutions began to establish offshore branches in former outposts of the British Empire. Their aim was to create offshore centres with strong secrecy legislation in order to attract capital from across the globe.
Swiss banking secrecy is the most famous, the most well-known. You put your money in a Swiss bank and they promise not to tell anybody, and that's one kind of secrecy. But another kind of secrecy, which is very British, is the trust. And the trust is a very slippery, complicated, and devious mechanism.
In Britain's offshore jurisdictions, no qualifications are necessary to be a trustee. Anyone can set up a trust and act as a trustee. There is no registry of trusts. There are no bodies to certify that a trust has been set up.
The only persons who know about the creation of this agreement are the trustee and the settlor. There's no obligation to register it. There is no financial reporting obligation of trusts. They're not required to put annual statements onto account anywhere. So actually trusts are, to all intents and purposes, invisible arrangements.
Economist John Christensen was an economic advisor to the secrecy jurisdiction of Jersey for 10 years.
We're not talking about a few million. We're talking now about trillions. Trillions of dollars of capital, which apparently belong to nobody. For tax purposes and for other purposes, they belong to nobody. Everything, works of arts, gold bullion, racehorses, cars, real estate, not just financial assets, but a whole load of non-financial assets belong to these trusts, sitting there belonging to nobody. Now think that one through, because we are talking about maybe as much as $50 trillion of assets sitting offshore behind these instruments.
An offshore structure will often have a trust kind of sitting at the top of it. The trust will be here managing the assets, kind of controlling the assets. Underneath it, the trust will own some shell companies. Each one might be in a different jurisdiction. So you might have a trust in one jurisdiction whose trustees are somewhere else, whose beneficiaries are somewhere else, which owns offshore companies somewhere else. Each of these companies might then own assets, so that they might own, a bank account, a racehorse, a yacht, a painting, a portfolio of shares or whatever.
There are numerous variations of trusts and offshore secrecy structures. There are offshore lawyers whose work entails the creation of ever more complex and obscure structures. The aim of these structures is to hide the identity of the owners of offshore assets and allow offshore wealth to be recycled back into global markets. When countries complain to Britain about the activities run out of its offshore havens, Britain claims that these places are independent and that there is nothing it can do.
I've heard time and time again from officials in Berlin and in Paris and in Washington and in other countries that they've been told by the British government that, yes, they're well aware of what's going on in Jersey and they think it's very unfortunate, but they don't have the powers to intervene. Well, that's a straightforward lie. They do have the powers to intervene. They just choose not to.
Britain plays this kind of game of pretending, when it suits them, to pretend that these places are independent. At the end of the day, Britain appoints the governor, appoints lots of senior people in these places. They're responsible for foreign relations and defence, and also they can veto their legislation as well. So Britain has a massive degree of control. Basically, it is controlling these places, allowing them a little bit of political space.
By keeping its power hidden, Britain is able to claim that these jurisdictions are politically autonomous. When the Bahamas declared independence from Britain in 1967, the offshore bankers relocated to the Cayman Islands and continued their business from there. It was the British connection that reassured bankers and their clients that their money was safe.
This British bedrock, that is what has allowed these places to become so trusted by the financial services industry and offshore finance and all these people.
In reality, much of the wealth administered in Britain's offshore havens is controlled from London.
The City of London, by and large, likes to do its really dirty work outside London. There might, heaven forbid, be a regulator who actually takes the job seriously and starts to prosecute them for fraud in London. So better to do the frauds offshore in Gibraltar or Jersey, where there's much less risk that a serious prosecution will ever happen.
Deals are often discussed and concluded in London, but then registered offshore for tax, transparency, and regulatory purposes.
What they allow the city to do is to get involved in dirty business, but then when the scandal hits, to say, well, they're kind of independent, there's nothing we can do about those places, that's not us, that's tax haven activity, and we're the city, we're not involved in that kind of stuff. So it's an incredibly kind of convenient relationship.
The City of London has shaped the way in which Jersey, Guernsey, and the British Overseas Territories have developed as tax havens. I see these places as the Frankensteins created by the City of London.
The soldiers left, the administrators left all the colonies, but they still kept a significant degree of control over the financial flows from these the former parts of empire and the rest of the world. So you could describe it as a second empire, Britain's second empire, sort of hidden financial empire spanning large parts of the globe.
At the time of the British Empire, the City of London was the world's largest global financial centre. Not only Britain's colonies, but also independent countries did their banking in London and used the empire's currency for trade and financing. As the empire declined, so too did the City of London. The establishment of the London Euro market enabled City of London banks to continue to exploit their empire-era networks and expertise, and the creation of secrecy jurisdictions gave banks access to large amounts of cheap money. International banks from across the globe set up branches in London and Britain's offshore jurisdictions in order to take advantage of this new system.
This system has taken the place of the occupation. up till 62. For France, I don't know for England, but about the same time, England were physically present in India, for instance, or in other colonies. And when you look at the money flows through the tax havens, they are increasing when we withdraw from the colonies. We are still plundering developing countries as former colonial powers.
Wealthy individuals, organized crime, and corporations shifted their wealth offshore in exchange for secrecy and no tax. And as countries around the world began to deregulate and open their economies, it became ever easier to do so. Today, as much as half of all global offshore wealth may be hidden in Britain's secrecy jurisdictions. One of the losers is Africa, whose flight capital flows mostly into the modern British spider's web.
I think it's no coincidence that Britain's offshore empire emerged more or less at the same time as the collapse of the former empire. We tend to think of Africa as being a huge net debtor to the rest of the world. But that was the extent of their debts at the end of 2008, 177 billion.
The debt of sub-Saharan African nations stood at $177 billion in 2008. Yet the wealth these countries' elites had moved offshore between 1970 and 2008 is estimated at $944 billion, over 5 times their foreign debt.
$944 billion. Do the maths. Far from being a net debtor, Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is a net creditor to the rest of the world.
As capital moved offshore, African nations borrowed money from international banks at high interest. Over time, these debts became so great that they may never be repaid. Secrecy jurisdictions were starving developing nations of their wealth and their tax revenues.
For a long time, a lot of developing countries, including recently Ecuador, have been trying to set up a UN tax body which is of a higher value than what is currently there, which is the UN Tax Committee. And every time this has happened, it has gotten blocked. During the financing for development process in Addis Ababa last year, I think it was the UK and the US that blocked attempts again to set up this World Tax Organization. So why would they not want to have democratic decision-making in global decisions on how tax gets collected across borders? I don't understand this. As long as we have cross-border activity that involves both criminal and legal activity, as long as we're unable to separate the two, this is going to continue to be a problem.
Western nations block attempts to provide greater transparency of international financial flows and the implementation of global standards for the collection of tax across borders, whilst elites in developing nations use offshore centres to hide their wealth offshore.
The oil from Gabon has not benefited people in Gabon. And this is true for the copper in Zambia, for the gold in Mozambique or in Mali. They have benefited the company that do extract it and their shareholders. It has benefited the corrupt elite in the country.
In developing countries, the offshore system of tax havens has facilitated the looting of these countries by their elites. It has enabled them to steal the money and keep it safe somewhere else.
Illicit financial flows, because the anonymity that drives them creates incentives for people in positions of power to be corrupt. This is why there's a group of countries where development progress is so difficult. It's that the incentives of individuals and the ability to pursue them through all the mechanisms that underpin illicit flows outweigh the type of mechanisms that lead you to a powerful, representative, effective state that can start to deliver development.
Worldwide, Developing countries lose over $1 trillion every year in capital flight and tax evasion. Most of this wealth flows into large Western nations like the United States and Britain and enables their currencies to stay strong, whilst developing nations' currencies remain weak.
Every country looks to its foreign exchange rate, and the foreign exchange rate is not only imports and exports, it's capital movements. And if you look at the International Monetary Fund's monthly international financial statistics, you have sort of a steady balance of trade, a steady immigrants' remittances. What goes up and down are called errors and omissions. What the United Nations and the IMF call errors and omissions are flight capital. It's the reason that it's omitted is they don't like to really look at this. I guess now you call it errors and omissions. You don't call it criminal inflow and outflow.
A strange mixture of characters populate the offshore world. British ex-public schoolboys, members of the world's intelligence services, global criminals, assorted lords and ladies, and bankers galore. The same lawyers and accountants who set up and administer offshore trusts also occupy senior political positions. In Britain's offshore world, most politicians are in business. They lobby for business and promote business interests. They draft, refine, and pass legislation. Politicians sit on the boards of the companies they are supposed to regulate.
There is no place for dirty money in Britain. Indeed, there should be no place for dirty money anywhere.
In public, British politicians claim they are cracking down on secrecy jurisdictions and corruption. But in practice, they do the opposite.
When I talk to politicians in Brussels, they say that they've had more lobbyists from London, and including politicians, come to them to protect the City of London's interests than they've had from every other European member state combined, which gives you some idea of the extent to which British politicians see themselves as essentially lobbyists for the City of London.
Many British politicians have personal and business ties with the City of London and British secrecy jurisdictions. Former British Prime Minister David Cameron's father, Ian Cameron, was an expert in offshore funds and was involved in offshore trusts from the 1980s onwards.
At this courthouse behind me here in St Helier, we found this. It's a document called a grant of probate, and it's attached to the English will of none other than Ian Cameron, David Cameron's father.
Say hello to Mum and Dad. Hi, how are you? Good to see you.
Ian Cameron was certainly a wealthy man. In 2009, his personal fortune was estimated by researchers for the Sunday Times Rich List at £10 million. Yet when Ian Cameron died in 2010, his estate was much smaller than might be expected, just £2.7 million.
In many cases, it's the politicians and their cronies and their families and so on, and the business people who sponsor the political parties, who are using these offshore services themselves. So they've got no personal interest in closing it down. If they wanted to close it down, they could do it tomorrow. The fact of the matter is they don't want to do it because they themselves are complicit with the process.
The British establishment, an old boys' network of privileged elites, had carved out a lucrative niche for themselves in the offshore world after the demise of empire. They transformed themselves from administrators of empire into financial handlers for the global elite and multinational corporations. As more money flowed offshore, societies around the globe began to feel the impact of the offshore world.
The reality is not what you believe, that your prime minister has the power to decide on the future of your country. The power is hidden here.
We have country after country around the world where the lack of financial transparency about taxation, about ownership, about corruption has undermined the extent to which governments deliver representative policymaking for their citizens.
We have former ministers acting as advisors to accountancy firms. Accountancy firms provide jobs and consultancies for potential ministers. To my mind, really, it's an indication of corrupt structures. People are buying and selling influences. When a former minister works for an accountancy firm, he's not providing any accounting knowledge, he's opening political opportunities, home and abroad. That is what they are doing.
The reason we were protesting outside the Africa PPP conference is that we wanted to make sure that citizens back in Africa should hear about the fact that such policies have been a complete failure here in the UK. We know that these products are not being marketed to African countries in their own best interests. The only motivation is to spread the reach of financial services into new markets. It's all being promoted in the interest of the City of London. What you're seeing is basically a second form of colonialisation. You've had initially occupation, resource extraction, and through that process, countries like Britain, which have had a large offshore empire, have developed significant networks, and now those networks are being used to promote and exploit financial services.
Winnie Byanyima had a humbling message for the world's most powerful people meeting here in Davos. They are too rich.
This concentration of wealth, extreme concentration of wealth in the hands of a few people, is damaging for all of us.
Oxfam's report titled An Economy for the 99% argues that the global economy is set up to favor the rich while the poorest people don't stand a chance.
The global corporations have been able to influence political decision making and are now able to avoid paying their fair share of taxes. They are able to push down corporate tax rates at the country level, so they get away without paying their fair share. Then they're able to drive down wages to keep workers' wages stagnant. They've been stagnant for the last 30 years, while their own pay at the top has been skyrocketing.
The charity is calling for global tax reform so that big multinationals are required to be more transparent about how they make their profits. It also wants guaranteed minimum wages, especially for those who work full-time.
In Uganda recently, they were being given free money that they had done a good job for the country and saved and won a court case. So each one was being given 100 million, 80 million to take home. Civil servants. When people are wallowing in poverty, this is political capture. This is elite capture. You cannot do that. You can't take public money and concentrate it in the hands of a few, while the majority are being taxed, because it is their money which you are taking from them to hand to the top.
We need structural change. We need to find an economic order that promotes equality rather than the hoarding of wealth by a few.